Okay, so our webinar today is understanding how morphology helps spelling. So morphology is a really important part of the spelling skill. And I would recommend that you go and have a look, if you haven't already, at the webinar called What Makes an Effective Speller. So this is available on our webinars page to watch the past recording. It was myself and Karis, and we talked about all the different skills that go into spelling. So that webinar kind of explains how we get to the point of needing morphology and how it's important as part of the spelling skill. But today we're diving deeper into morphology and really starting to begin looking at how that helps the spelling more. Okay, so
Okay, so we have, thank you. We have over 500 words and phrases in the Oxford English Dictionary that we can use, obviously. The average person has an active vocabulary of around 20,000 words. So that's what words that a person uses day to day in their language. They also have a passive vocabulary of around 40,000 words. So these are words that they understand, but do not generally use necessarily with confidence in their writing, reading, speaking, etc. So it's quite a lot of words to remember when you're coming to spelling them. So if we think about what morphology is, if we break it down into its component parts, you've got morph, which is form, and the ology, which means the study of. So morphology as a whole is the study of how words are formed. Now, morphologists, so that's people who study words, believe that words are like onions. Okay, so they believe you've got the core of a word in the middle. So in this example, it's pure. And then you've got the suffixes and prefixes that can be added on to that core. The core of the word can be split into two parts or understood in two ways, the base word or the root word. So now a base word can stand alone in English when all the affixes, those prefixes and suffixes, have been removed. So for example, side, help, play, run, they're all examples of base words. You've then got root words, which are words that come from the origin language and they do not always stand alone in English. So more, rupt, ord, they're all examples of root words. We do sometimes get some words such as photo and act at the bottom there, which I've underlined because they can actually be a base word because they can stand alone in English, but they do come from the origin language. So photo, for example, is Greek. If we look at the morphemes that make up some words, the layers of the words, morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in a word. So we've got that can be made up from those roots and bases, and also there's prefixes and suffixes. So if we look at these two words at the bottom, we've got unreachable, which if we break it into its morphemes, those smallest units of meaning, you've got reach in the middle, which is your base and root, un as your prefix, and able as your suffix there. So obviously altogether, if un is not and able obviously is able to, it would be that they're not able to be reached or something's not able to be reached. With construction, the three morphemes that make up that word, you've got con, which means together, struct, which is that root word there, which means build, and ion on the end, that suffix, it means act of. So essentially it's the act of building things together. Now, there are different ways of representing these words. As I've already spoken about, we've got the onion concept on the left there for repurify. So those morphologists, although they believe it's like onions, they don't always draw it in that way. They use these trees here on the top right, just to talk about how the suffixes and prefixes can be added. So pure there would then be adding that ify ending to make it purify, and then the re beginning would then add on to that verb there to make it repurify. We can also add on, see it as a symbolizing at the bottom where you're adding on the component words, and then that word you're ending up with at the end there.
And often in Spelling Shed, that's the one we tend to use for the children, is adding the component parts. It just doesn't go quite as deep as some of the morphology opinions like the onion or the tree example.
Compound words can also help us when we're looking at morphology. So again, it's all about those meaning. So compound words are two or more words that have been grouped together to make a new word. So foot and ball is football, so you can talk about how it's a foot. And then you've got a ball that's kicked with your feet. Hair and brush, obviously hairbrush. Brush, that's they used to brush the hair. We can also go a bit more complex into our compound words. They can also help with our spelling, because sometimes how we say it isn't necessarily how it's spelled. So for example, with breakfast, we don't say it as break fast. But if the children understand that actually it's breaking the fast of overnight, it can help them with that spelling. So if we don't understand it in that way, the spelling on the right there, that breakfast spelling, can be how the children spell it. Like with blackberry, very rarely do we say black, it's a blackberry. If children understand those two component parts, they're more likely to get the spelling correctly. Same in cupboard, the fact that it was a board originally that shelved cupboards and shelved cups, sorry. That would help with that spelling. And again, same with blueberry. If it's a blueberry, they're likely to get those component parts spelled, as opposed to any of the suggestions on the right there with blueberry.
And we use in Spelling Shed these morphology matrix examples that show how these morphemes combine really well. So here in the middle, I've got a base word, I've got cover, makes sense on its own in English, so that's why it's a base word. And on the left, there are some prefixes in blue. So these are parts that I can add to the word. I can make it recover or uncover. And on the right, I've got some suffixes, so in the purple there. So I could have covered, covering, covers, or coverage. So you can use a prefix and a suffix at the same time. So I could say recovering, but you don't want to make up nonsense words for these, really. So you don't want uncoverage, because that doesn't make any sense. So these are used to make and combine these parts so that we end up with some new words. Now this is quite a simple one where I've only got one layer of prefix and one layer of suffix, but in this one here I've got some stacked suffixes, so I'm adding more than one suffix on, which means you end up with all these columns of suffix. Now what you don't want to do here is jump over a suffix column. So I've got the ly suffix on the very far right hand side twice there, but I can't have sensely. Makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I've skipped some of the suffixes in the columns if I do that. So I don't want to do that. I would build it up bit by bit. So sensation, sensational, sensationally. So I build it up bit by bit by bit. Sometimes when you start adding these layers together in your words, you end up with slight word changes. So that's what the stars are all about on this screenshot here. They link to your PowerPoint notes in Spelling Shed that talk about those spelling changes. But I've just pulled out two here. So I've got sensational. When I'm adding ation to sense, I lose the E off sense. So that's why that one's got a star there. And then I've also picked out sensibly. When I add the ly suffix to the ible suffix, because ible ends in le, I knock that off before I added my ly, so I don't end up with all of that there. That's why that one's got 2 stars on. Now, I've pulled out those words because we've got this bit of a flowchart, which can be a nice way to show children how these spelling changes work. So if you start thinking about words you want to add this ly suffix to, does the word end in a y? If it does, you can just replace the y with an I and add the ly suffix. If it doesn't, does it end in an le? If it does, you drop the le and add the ly suffix, like that sensibly example that we talked about on the previous slide. And the final one, if it doesn't end in a y or an le, then you just add the ly, so sensationally. Got some more words here, so bad to badly, that one's where it doesn't end in a y or an le. Angry ends in a y, so I change the y to an I and add the ly. And terrible ends in le, so I take off the le before adding my ly suffix. Now I've gone through some of the word lists for the statutory word list for year 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, and also looked at some of the common exception words that are used in Key Stage 1 and pulled a few of them out to focus on the morphemes. So in Key Stage 1, there's lots of times you could use morphemes. For example, clothes is on the common exception word list, but actually if you look at it as cloth, and then adding that es for the plural, it makes a lot more sense, and you end up with that spelling more correct, because rather than leaning on your phonics there. Here I've got today. Again, if I spell the parts of it, so to, which I would learn as a common exception word, and then day, which follows my general spelling patterns of using the AY pattern at the end of words. When I add them together, I spell today. I can also apply that to tonight, tomorrow, towards, and use that same concept there. And another one on that word list is beautiful. So if I start with the root of beaut, add the E suffix, or sometimes people do treat that all as one, beauty, because then at least you're starting with a full word that makes sense on its own. That's okay to do. And then add my full suffix on, but then I start to understand why I'm changing that Y to an I if I go through that flow chart that we talked about earlier. So that pattern of changing Y changing to an I is taught in year 2 in the spring term. There's lots of different suffixes where you're adding them to it with the Y changing to the I. And then when you get to the end of the spring term, spring 1 term, in that challenge words week, beautiful is in there. So you can talk about that same pattern that's happened there. Another Key Stage 1 example is the word said, which people often say is really, really difficult to spell. But actually, the spelling of said makes a lot more sense than what you think. It's the pronunciation that we've changed along the way. So here I've got some base words, pay, lay, and say. If I change it into the third person present, I just add an S, so pays and lays. And I can say says, but more commonly in a lot of places in the UK, I would say says. So you can hear that slight pronunciation change there. So I've got that eh sound instead of the full a sound. And that's exactly the same as what's happening in the word said. So paid, laid, said. There's very few people that would pronounce it nowadays as said. So it isn't normally pronounced as said. But actually that spelling of the past tense we've got there really does make sense. Because if I start from say, and then I add my past tense suffix of ed normally, well, then I'd have a y before my suffix, so I change it to an I. And then I've got a, I, e, d all in a row. So I drop the e and just use the d past tense suffix. Otherwise, it looks like too many vowels in a row in one word. So it's following all our normal spelling conventions for that word. It's just pronounced a little bit differently. In lower key stage 2, I can find that morphology really helps me with some suffixes. So I get lots of shun sounding suffixes in lower key stage 2. So I've got tion, cian, and sion. If I start from the base word or the root, that can help me spell the complete word with the suffix on. So if I start from magic, I've already got a C, and then when I change it into magician, even though the sound hasn't got a C in it anymore, it's not got a k sound in it anymore, I've still already got that C from the base word, so I know which shun to use on the end of it. The same for question, start with quest, move to question, and possess into possession. So it gives me a bit of a hint of which one I'm meant to be using when. This can be applied to other spelling patterns as well. So here I've got some shulls, and in face, it's the C-I-A-L spelling, which I've already got the C in face. And in part, it's the T-I-A-L spelling, which I've already got the T in part. So starting from your base and then stepping up to adding your suffixes or prefixes on can really, really help. And a lot of the words on the year 5 and 6 word list were connected with this this root com, which means with or together. So here are some examples. I've got accommodate at the top because that is one of the most commonly misspelled words. So accommodate is a word of 4 morphemes. Ac, which means to or toward. Com, which means with or together. Mod, which means make fit, and ate, which is a suffix that makes verbs. So it means to perform an action. So the whole total meaning of the word is a verb to make fit together. Now, how does that help me with spelling it? Well, one of the biggest problems with accommodate is you don't know how many C's to put in, you don't know how many M's to put in. It's which letters to double and which letters to not double. But if you break it into the 4 morphemes, ac, com, mod, 8, it gives you a really clear structure as to where you're getting those double letters. Whereas if you go phonetically, it doesn't tell you whether you're using 1 C or 2. The same happens in accompany with those 2 roots that are the same there at the beginning, and then the pani bit at the end is a variant of the pa root, which means to protect or feed. Committee also has that com root in, meaning with or together. Mit is a root meaning to send as well, which can be in a lot of words that we look at, like intermittent. And I've got even more here. So it's mainly at the beginning, this com root, which means with or together in all of these words. I quite liked competition, thinking about it as striving together or seeking a goal in rivalry. The striving together bit I found really interesting. The bottom word here, recommend, you've got it where you've got a prefix on the beginning as well, so it's not actually at the beginning of a word. So the re means again, com meaning with or together, and mend meaning entrust or command. So if you recommend something, you're suggesting it to somebody with some authority. And there are absolutely loads of words with this com root in. So earlier, Amanda mentioned construction. That is also connected to the same root. It's just a slightly different variant of it. And then if we're talking about struct as the root, the shun bit that we were talking about in lower key stage 2 can also really help there. It's really interesting to see how all the words are connected when you start looking at them like this. Okay, so that is the end of our webinar just there. We've just got to tell you about our school training, because if you go on the EdShed website and go on the training page, we have recently launched our new version of the Spelling Shed training. So that's available, and it is bespoke training packages that you can design and pick the units that you want delivered in your school. So it's really worth going and having a look at that.